All right, let's set the scene. Our story begins where many others end, in a birthing chamber. The year is 1457, the place is a cold, grim castle in Wales, and a 13-year-old girl is in the middle of an ordeal that would terrify a grown woman. But this isn't just any birth. This girl is a widow. The baby she's about to bring into the world isn't just a baby. He's a weapon, a claim, her one and only lottery ticket out of utter ruin. So who is this kid stuck at the absolute center of a dynastic storm? Her name was Margaret Beaufort, a name history rarely slaps the title Queen onto, but maybe should have, considering she was one of the most effective kingmakers in English history. Which brings us to our core question. How does a teenage girl whose only legal value was her, her ability to produce an heir, not only survive England's most brutal civil war, but actually win it? To even begin to answer that, you first have to understand the absolutely bonkers world she was born into, a place we call the Wars of the Roses. Then we'll follow the series of personal tragedies that would forge her into a weapon of pure, unshakable will. And finally, we'll open the case file on just how she played the long game, using piety and patience to orchestrate the ultimate checkmate. But before we dive into all that, we're curious, what time is it, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Let us know how far this crazy story has traveled. It turns out when you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you get dangerously creative. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we find that history's most unbreakable wills are often forged in the fires of personal tragedy. So to understand how a 13-year-old girl, a child by any modern standard, could possibly become the secret architect of an entire dynasty, you first have to understand the world that forged her. And let me tell you, the world of mid-15th century England was, to put it mildly, a dumpster fire. A glorious, crown-jeweled, absolute dumpster fire of ambition, betrayal, and really, really bad family dynamics. This is the world of the Wars of the Roses. Now that name, the Wars of the Roses, sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? It conjures up images of knights fighting over a beautiful flower in a garden. The reality was less like a gardening competition, and more like the world's most brutal Thanksgiving dinner, a family reunion from hell that lasted for 30 years. And instead of arguing over who gets the last piece of turkey, they were arguing over who gets the crown of England. And they settled their differences with longbows, broadswords, and a shocking amount of public beheadings. So who are the two sides of this dysfunctional family squabble? On one side, you have the reigning champions, the House of Lancaster. Their symbol was the red rose. They had the crown, they had the power, they were the establishment. The problem was their King Henry VI was, he was a man who, to put it charitably, was often not home. He was famous for these long vacant spells, these periods of total mental collapse where you could probably set his crown on fire and he wouldn't notice. He was a good, pious man, but as a king, he was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. And in the brutal world of medieval politics, a power vacuum like that is an invitation for chaos. Nature abhors a vacuum, and ambitious noblemen abhor it even more. And into this power vacuum steps the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. Think of them as the overachieving, hyper-competent cousins who are sick and tired of watching the family business be run into the ground. Their leader, the Duke of York, had a claim to the throne that was arguably even stronger than the king's. He was capable, he was powerful, and he was ambitious. And he looked at the dithering, vacant King Henry VI and thought, you know what, I could do better. That's the basic setup. A weak king from one family branch and a strong, ambitious challenger from another. The result was 3 decades of absolute, bloody chaos. This wasn't a war with clean lines. It was a vicious, messy personal conflict where alliances shifted like sand. Your greatest ally one day could be the man signing your death warrant the next. It was a period where kings were captured, deposed, put back on the throne, and then deposed again. The nobility of England was systematically wiping itself out in a mad scramble for power. This was the world Margaret Beaufort was born into, a world of constant lethal uncertainty. So where do women fit into this? Let's call it a sausage fest of swords and crowns. Well, for the most part, they didn't. A woman's role was to be seen, not heard, and to produce heirs. You were a supporting character in someone else's story, unless, that is, you were an heiress. Ah, the heiress. In the 15th century, being a great heiress meant you weren't really a person. You were a prize. You were a walking, talking bundle of land titles, and most importantly, claims. Your hand in marriage wasn't a romantic proposition, it was a corporate merger. You were the ultimate political commodity, a key that could unlock immense power, and the men around you would fight to the death to possess you. You were a pawn, but a very, very powerful one. And this brings us to our girl, Margaret Beaufort. In the great grim lottery of feudal inheritance, Margaret had hit a very strange kind of jackpot. So what made her so special? Why was this one little girl such a valuable piece on the board? It all came down to blood. To understand her value, you have to take a quick trip back one generation to her grandfather. Her grandfather was a Beaufort, and the Beauforts were the children of the very powerful John of Gaunt, who was a son of King Edward III. So royal blood, right? The problem was the Beauforts were born. Well, you know, their parents weren't married at the time. They were illegitimate. Later on, the Pope and the King of England did the paperwork, and the Beauforts were officially legitimized. They were made fully legitimate in the eyes of God and the law. Fantastic news. But, and this is a Sir Mix-a-Lot sized, but a but so big it has its own zip code. When they were legitimized, the official act included a little line, a bit of legal fine print that specifically barred them and their descendants from ever inheriting the throne. It's an infamous little phrase in Latin, accepta dignitate regale, the royal dignity is accepted. So what does this mean for Margaret? It means her claim to the throne was like a Schrodinger's cat of royal succession. It was both worthless and priceless at the exact same time. It was technically invalid because of that little legal clause, but she was still the great-granddaughter of a king. Her blood was still royal. Her claim was just weak enough that you could ignore it if you wanted to, but it was just strong enough that if you were ambitious and a little bit creative with the law, you could make a real problem with it. And that right there, that ambiguous, legally gray area quality would define her entire life. It made her the perfect pawn. She wasn't a direct threat like the Duke of York, but marrying her could give someone else's potential children a distant but tantalizing link to the throne. So who are the other key players in our story, the ones who would be fighting over this very special pawn? Well, besides the warring houses of York and Lancaster, we have to introduce a new family, a family that at the time were basically royal upstarts, the Tudors, specifically two brothers Edmund and Jasper Tudor. Who were they? Well, their mother was a French princess who had been married to the previous King of England, Henry V. After he died, she secretly married a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor. Edmund and Jasper were their sons. This made them the half-brothers of the current king, Henry VI. They were family, but they were new money, new power. They needed to secure their position in the viper's nest of the English court. And what's the fastest way to secure your position? You marry a great heiress. And so we have our board set. We have a kingdom tearing itself apart. We have a little girl who is both a political afterthought and an incredibly valuable prize. And we have a pair of ambitious brothers who need to lock down their family's future. King Henry VI, in a rare moment of strategic thinking, or maybe just tidying up his family affairs, decided to hand this prize, the 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, over to his older half-brother Edmund Tudor. And with that one decision, he set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a terrified little girl walking down the aisle, completely unaware that her own personal tragedy was about to become the foundation of a dynasty that would change England and the world forever. And that story, the story of what happened to her next in that marriage, is where our investigation truly begins. So in the last part, we establish the board, a kingdom at war with itself, a collection of ambitious men fighting for a crown, and At the center of it all, a little girl named Margaret Beaufort, this human lottery ticket, with a uniquely complicated claim to the throne. We left off as the reigning king, Henry VI, made a fateful decision, handing the 12-year-old Margaret over to his ambitious half-brother, Edmund Tudor, as a prize. What happens when a 12-year-old girl is treated like a stock option, when her entire existence is reduced to a single political purpose? Well, the story of what happened next, the story that would define the rest of her life, unfolds in 3 acts. 3 distinct defining moments of personal tragedy that would take a child and systematically forge her into a weapon of unbreakable will. Our first act we'll call the transaction. Let's be crystal clear about what this was. In November of 1455, Margaret Beaufort was married to Edmund Tudor. She was 12, he was 24. This was not a love story. This was not a romance. This was a hostile takeover bid for a bloodline. It was a cold, calculated political move designed to tie Margaret's valuable, if messy, claim to the Tudor family, and by extension, to the struggling House of Lancaster. It was about assets, not affection. Can you imagine being 12? Your biggest concerns are maybe learning your Latin, getting your needlepoint right, and trying not to displease your governess. Margaret's biggest concern was being formally handed over body and soul to a man twice her age to begin the grim dynastic business of, securing the succession. The pressure on her to fulfill this role, to do her duty, must have been immense. She was known to be an incredibly pious and serious child, and one can only imagine the terror she must have felt cloaked in the language of honor and obligation. And Edmund, bless his ambitious heart, did not waste any time. The whole point of acquiring the prize was to get a return on the investment. And in this world, that meant one thing: an heir. The political clock was ticking. The Lancastrian cause needed to strengthen its position, and a new baby with royal blood, no matter how complicated, would be a powerful symbol. And so, with a speed that is frankly horrifying to our modern minds, the transaction was completed. Before her 13th birthday, Margaret Beaufort was pregnant, and all while this deeply personal, deeply disturbing drama is unfolding, the country outside the castle walls is continuing its slide into utter chaos. The political situation was deteriorating. The Duke of York was making his move. The first battles of the Wars of the Roses were being fought. It was no longer just a cold war of political maneuvering. It was a hot war, and Edmund Tudor, as a loyal brother to the king, had a job to do. This brings us to Act 2, the part of our story we must call the ordeal. So what does a loyal soldier do when his king calls? He goes to fight. And what does he do with his valuable pregnant 12-year-old wife? Well, naturally, he takes her with him. He brings her to the front lines, to a remote fortified castle in Wales, right in the middle of a war zone. A fantastic decision, really. An absolutely brilliant piece of strategic planning. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler alert, everything went wrong, almost immediately. While trying to enforce the king's authority, in Wales, Edmund gets captured by the forces of the House of York, and then, just to add insult to fatal injury, while imprisoned, he contracts the plague and dies. Just like that. In November of 1456, he was gone. So let's just take a moment to absorb this. Let's paint the picture. Margaret is now 13 years old. She is 7 months pregnant. She is a widow, and she is completely alone, a high-value Lancastrian asset, stuck in a castle now controlled by her enemies. The only friendly face in this entire terrifying situation is her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, who managed to secure the castle and offer her his protection. For a 13-year-old girl, this is the stuff of absolute nightmares. Her entire world, her entire future, had evaporated in a matter of months. All that was left was the child inside her and the terrifying prospect of giving birth. On January 28, 1457, her ordeal reached its horrifying climax. The birth was, by all accounts, a catastrophe. We have to be serious here for a moment, because this is the event that truly shaped her. This was a tiny girl whose own body was not yet fully grown, being forced to endure a labor that was agonizingly long and violent. Her small frame was simply not ready for such a trauma. The historical records are sparse on the specific medical details, but they don't need to be. We know it was a nightmare. Some historians, based on the extreme and often brutal medical practices of the time for a stalled labor, have painted an even grimmer picture. They suggest the possibility that her ladies, in a desperate attempt to save her and the baby, may have had to resort to a terrifying procedure, a last-ditch effort that involved placing Margaret on a large sheet and using it to toss her to physically shake the baby out of a body that could not deliver it. It is an unimaginable medieval torture. Press the like button if you also shuddered at that detail. Somehow, through sheer force of will, she survived. The baby, a boy she named Henry, survived. But the cost was immense. The ordeal left her permanently damaged, physically scarred in a way that meant she would never be able to have another child. It was a miracle she didn't die, a miracle that would give her a singular, obsessive purpose for the rest of her life. She had one son, and she would have only one son. He was everything. This leads us to our final tragic act, the separation. For a few years after the birth, Margaret and her son were able to live in relative peace under the protection of her brother-in-law Jasper. But the winds of war were blowing, and they were not blowing in their favor. In 1461, the House of York won a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton. Edward IV was the new king. The Lancastrians were either dead or in exile, and suddenly being a Lancastrian, even a baby one, with a shaky claim, was very, very bad for your health. Her son, little Henry Tudor, was now a liability. He was a potential figurehead for any future rebellion. He was a loose end that the New Yorkist regime needed to tie up. So what happens to the son of an enemy? He becomes a ward of the new king. His lands, his titles, his very identity were taken away. And the new king, Edward IV, sold Henry's wardship to one of his most loyal supporters. At the age of 4, Henry Tudor was torn from his mother's arms. To ensure her own survival and to have any hope of one day helping her son Margaret, was forced into another strategic marriage, this time to a powerful Yorkist supporter. It was her only move for 14 years. Let that sink in. For 14 years, from the time he was a small boy until he was a young man, she had to live apart from her only child, watching from a distance as he grew up in the household of her family's enemies. Powerless, helpless, a mother's worst nightmare. So now our story stands at its most desperate moment. We have a woman who has endured a forced marriage, a traumatic birth, the death of her husband, and now the loss of her only child. She has no power, no army, no influence. She is just a woman living quietly in the background of a hostile court. So how do you fight back from that? How do you wage a war when your only weapon, your son, is in the hands of the enemy? Well, that is the moment when Margaret Beaufort stopped being a pawn and started becoming a player. The story of how she did it, the story of her quiet, patient, 30-year-long game of political chess, is where things get truly brilliant. And that investigation is next. So at the end of our last part, we left Margaret Beaufort in what seemed like an impossible position. A mother forcibly separated from her only child for 14 years. A political outcast living quietly in the shadow of the powerful Yorkist throne that had defeated her family. She was, for all intents and purposes, powerless, helpless, a finished story. Or was she welcome to the chamber? This is the part of the show where we stop just telling the story and start taking it apart. We put on our detective hats, we dust for fingerprints, and we examine the evidence. So let's open the case file on the 30-year conspiracy of Margaret Beaufort. The central question is the one we've been building towards. How does a pawn on the board suddenly start directing the entire game? Now, the popular lazy version of history likes to paint Margaret as just a pious, patient woman who got incredibly lucky, that her son just happened to be in the right place at the right time, happened to win a battle, and just sort of stumbled onto the throne. This version of the story is not only incredibly boring, it is flat out wrong. This was not luck. This was not an accident. This was a masterclass in strategy, patience, and a kind of ruthless determination that is frankly terrifying to behold. So let's throw that myth of the lucky, pious lady out the window, and let's look at the evidence. Exhibit her first and most brilliant weapon, the very thing designed to control her, the very cage she had been put in marriage. After her traumatic first marriage ended in widowhood and her son was taken from her, Margaret was once again a commodity to be traded. Her second marriage to a man named Henry Stafford was purely a survival move. It was about finding a safe harbor in the middle of the Yorkist storm, a way to live without being seen as a threat. But it's her third marriage after Stafford died that shows her true genius. This marriage was a masterstroke of political calculation, and it was to a man named Thomas Lord Stanley. We need to talk about Stanley. If the Wars of the Roses were a reality TV show, Lord Stanley would be the guy who makes it to the finale every single season by playing all sides against each other. He was the ultimate survivor, the ultimate political chameleon. His personal motto was basically, I am passionately and devotedly loyal to whoever is winning right now. He had fought for the Lancastrians, then he fought for the Yorkists. His loyalty was a flag that blew in whatever direction the political winds were strongest. He was slippery, he was opportunistic, and he was incredibly powerful, especially in the north of England. Now, for any other woman, marrying a man like Stanley would be a nightmare. You could never trust him. You would live in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when he might sell you out for a better offer. But Margaret Beaufort wasn't any other woman. She was a strategist, and she understood Lord Stanley's nature perfectly. She knew he would never be truly loyal to a cause, but he could be persuaded to be loyal to his own self-interest, and she decided to make her cause, and her son's cause, his self-interest. So what did she do? She played the part. On the surface, she became the perfect model Yorkist wife. She was famously pious, spending hours a day in the chapel. She was humble, she was charitable. She stayed out of the public eye. She ran Lord Stanley's massive households with quiet efficiency. She presented the perfect non-threatening mask to the world. And King Edward IV and later his brother Richard III, they all saw this. They saw the quiet religious wife of their loyal, if slippery, supporter, Lord Stanley. They saw nothing to fear, and that was her goal. But behind that mask, she was a master manipulator. She was subtly influencing her powerful husband, planting seeds of doubt, gathering information from his vast network, and patiently, quietly turning one of the Yorkist regime's most powerful assets into her own secret agent. It was a breathtakingly audacious, long-term gamble. This brings us to Exhibit B, the long game, or the secret spy network of a suburban mom. Okay, so she's secured her position inside the enemy's court. She has a powerful, if untrustworthy, husband. But how does she actually advance her cause? How does she communicate with her son Henry, who by this point had been forced to flee England altogether and was living in exile in France? Remember, this is the 15th century. There's no email, no burner phones. How do you run a conspiracy across the English Channel when every move you make is being watched? Well, again, she used her greatest weapon, her invisibility. In the hyper-masculine world of medieval politics, where power was measured in armies and castles and titles, women were largely overlooked. They were background characters. No one at court would seriously suspect the quiet, devout Lady Margaret of being the central hub of a vast secret intelligence network. The great lords of the realm, they worried about other great lords with armies. They weren't worried about a woman writing letters in her private chambers, and that was their mistake. Margaret, with a skill any modern intelligence chief would admire, built her network. She used a web of trusted physicians, priests, merchants, and family retainers, people who could travel between England and the continent without raising too much suspicion. She sent secret messages, likely encoded in seemingly innocent letters about family matters or religious texts. She smuggled money to her son to fund his meager existence in exile. For decades, she played the long game, patiently weaving her web-gathering information and making contact with other disaffected nobles who were growing tired of the Yorkist kings. Her absolute masterpiece of espionage came in 1483. After King Edward IV suddenly died, his brother Richard III seized the throne, and the infamous disappearance of the princes in the Tower occurred. The kingdom was in chaos and deeply divided, and Margaret saw her chance. From the shadows, she became one of the primary architects of a massive nationwide uprising against Richard III, known as Buckingham's Rebellion. She secretly coordinated with the Duke of Buckingham, who was supposed to be Richard's biggest ally, and planned a two-pronged attack, a rebellion at home, combined with an invasion by her son, Henry, from France. Now the rebellion failed. It failed spectacularly due to a combination of bad luck, bad weather, and terrible timing. But even in failure, it was a stunning achievement. It proved something vital to everyone. Margaret Beaufort was no longer just a quiet, pious widow. She was a major political player, a force to be reckoned with, capable of coordinating a nationwide conspiracy right under the king's nose. The mask was beginning to slip. This all sounds incredible, a plot from a movie, but it begs the question, how did she maintain the will to keep this up for nearly 30 years? The constant fear, the risk of discovery, the heartbreak of failure, the decades-long separation from her child. What fueled that kind of superhuman endurance? This brings us to our final and perhaps most important exhibit, Exhibit C, the unbreakable will, or the power of piety. Margaret was famously intensely religious. The easy explanation is to see this as simple, conventional faith. But for Margaret, it was something much more powerful. It was her psychological armor. It was her entire operating system. In her mind, this wasn't just a political game she was playing. This was a divine mission. She believed with every single fiber of her being that God had personally chosen her son Henry to be the one to end the decades of bloodshed and heal the fractured kingdom. This conviction, this absolute certainty of divine purpose, did three brilliant things for her. First, it gave her motivation. It transformed her ambition from what could be seen as a selfish personal desire to put her son on the throne into a righteous holy crusade. It gave her a moral and religious justification for all the plotting, the secrecy, and the manipulation. She wasn't just seeking power, she was doing God's work. Second, it gave her superhuman patience. If you truly believe that God is on your side, you can afford to wait. A decade, 2 decades. It's all just part of God's mysterious plan. The failure of Buckingham's rebellion wasn't a catastrophe. It was merely a test of her faith. This mindset allowed her to endure setbacks that would have broken anyone else. And third, and most brilliantly, her public piety was the perfect disguise. It was the ultimate camouflage. Who would ever suspect the humble woman who spent hours a day in the chapel, who was famous for her acts of charity, who washed the feet of the poor, of being a ruthless political mastermind, a spy master general orchestrating treason? No one. Her devotion wasn't fake, it was real. But she expertly leveraged the public perception of that devotion to create a shield behind which she could plot a revolution. So let's go back to our central idea of the cursed chamber. Margaret's curse. Her prison was being born a woman with a valuable bloodline in a world run by men. She was supposed to be a prize, a broodmare, a pawn. But what our investigation shows is that she took every single bar of that prison and systematically reforged it into a weapon. The cage of marriage became her political cover. Her invisibility as a woman became her cloak of espionage. And the personal trauma she endured became the fuel that ignited what she saw as a divine, unstoppable mission. She didn't break the curse. She weaponized it. In 1485, after decades of patient secret work, her son Henry Tudor finally landed in England with a small ragtag army. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, came down to one single battle. But would her greatest gamble, her trust in her slippery, opportunistic husband, Lord Stanley, who had brought his own army to the field, finally pay off? Or would he betray her at the last moment? The fate of a kingdom and the legacy of this incredible woman would be decided on a single muddy field in the English Midlands. And that final bloody chapter is next. So at the end of our last part, we left the entire fate of England and Margaret Beaufort's 30-year-long gamble hanging in the balance. Her son Henry Tudor had landed in England with a small army of exiles and French mercenaries. The reigning king, the formidable soldier Richard III, had assembled a much larger, more experienced force to crush him. And on a muddy field near a market town called Bosworth on August 22nd, 1485, these two armies finally met. This is it. the final act. Welcome to the echo chamber where we witness the aftermath and try to make sense of it all. Let's set the scene at Bosworth Field because on paper, this should have been a slaughter. Richard III was a proven brilliant military commander. Henry Tudor was, well, he had spent most of his life in exile and had virtually no military experience. And as the battle began, it looked like it was going exactly as planned for King Richard. Henry's forces were struggling. They were on the verge of collapse. It seemed that Margaret's grand, intricate, decades-long plan was about to end in a bloody failure right before the finish line. But remember our wild card. Remember the man Margaret had so carefully, so patiently cultivated for years, her husband, the master of opportunism, Lord Stanley. He and his brother William were also at Bosworth, but they weren't fighting. They were sitting on a nearby hill with a powerful, fresh army of several thousand men, just watching. Like two guys at a tennis match waiting to see who had the advantage before placing their final massive bet. Richard ordered them to join him. They refused. Henry pleaded for their help. They did nothing. They just waited. King Richard, seeing Henry's banner isolated and vulnerable, decided to end the battle himself. In a moment of incredible, reckless bravery, he gathered his personal bodyguard and launched a desperate, thunderous cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor, aiming to cut the head off the snake. And for a moment, it looked like he would succeed. He was cutting his way through Henry's men, getting closer and closer. And this is it. The moment Margaret Beaufort had spent 30 years planning for. The moment her entire life's gamble rested on. Would her slippery, treacherous, opportunistic husband finally pick a side? Or would he stand by and watch her only son be slaughtered before his very eyes? As Richard's charge slammed into Henry's guard, the decision was finally made. The Stanley army, which had been silent for the entire battle, finally moved. They came thundering down the hill, but they didn't charge for King Richard. They charged at King Richard. They crashed into the flank of his desperate charge, and in that one decisive moment, the entire course of English history changed. Richard was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and killed. The battle was over. So let's render our verdict. Was Margaret Beaufort just lucky? Did her son just happen to win a battle? Absolutely not. The Battle of Bosworth wasn't won by Henry Tudor on that August day. It was won by his mother months, years, decades before a single sword was drawn on that field. It was her 30-year-long game of influence and trust building. It was her patient, brilliant psychological manipulation of Lord Stanley that placed that army on that hill and aimed it like a dagger at the heart of her enemy. It was the ultimate checkmate planned 30 years in advance. And what about the ripple effect? What was the legacy of this incredible patient victory? Well, it was nothing less than the creation of modern England. With that one battle, the 30-year family reunion from hell was finally over. The Wars of the Roses were done. The Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that would give England Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, had begun. The Middle Ages in England effectively died on that field with King Richard, and the Renaissance was about to begin. And what of Margaret? The quiet plotter in the shadows. She was about to step into the light, and she did it in a way that was just as calculating and brilliant as everything else she had ever done. She didn't just retire. Oh no, she took on a new, carefully crafted title, My Lady the King's Mother. Not Queen Mother because she had never been a queen consort, but the King's Mother. It was a statement of fact and a title of immense power. By an act of Parliament, she was granted lands and legal independence, usually only reserved for a queen. She lived in apartments at court that rivaled the new queen's. She signed her name Margaret R, the R, standing for Regina, the Latin for queen. She went from being a ghost in the political machine to sitting in the driver's seat. For the next 24 years until her death, she was one of her son's closest and most trusted advisors. She managed her vast estates with incredible skill, becoming one of the wealthiest women in England. She navigated the treacherous waters of the new Tudor court with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had built the ship, charted the course, and weathered every storm to bring it home. But her legacy isn't just political, and this perhaps is the most fascinating part of her final chapter. With her immense wealth and power, she became one of England's greatest ever patrons of education and religion. She founded two of the most famous colleges at Cambridge University, Christ College and St. John's College, which are still thriving today. The woman who was denied a formal education herself, whose childhood was stolen by dynastic politics, spent her final years ensuring that future generations of young men would have the opportunities she never did. And so, this brings us back to where we started, back to that 13-year-old girl in that cold stone room. Because that moment, that trauma, is the key to understanding everything. The real story, the cursed chamber of Margaret Beaufort, is not just that she suffered, but that her suffering became her superpower. It poses one final haunting question. Her entire life, all the plotting, the founding of a dynasty, the ending of a war. Was it all for the abstract good of the realm? Or was it all, at its very core, the 30-year quest of a mother shaped by an almost unimaginable childhood trauma, who was simply terrifyingly determined to give her only son the power and the security that she had been so brutally denied? It's a chilling reminder that the grand sweeping narratives of history, the stories of kings and queens and battles, are often driven by the most intimate and intensely personal human experiences. History isn't shaped by gods or destiny, but by flawed, wounded, and sometimes unbelievably determined people. People like Margaret. What do you think of Margaret Beaufort, saintly survivor or ruthless political operator? Let us know your verdict in the comments below. And if you found this journey into one of history's most unbreakable wills fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next investigation. The past is waiting.